So we've got some awnless products which are starting to, I suppose, get back into the system. Now, what's the value of awnlessness? And dual purpose was mentioned, and really it's about having a wheat hay product, which is, whether it's higher value always, but definitely easier to sell and more suited to the market. So if there was enough of an awnless wheat, then it definitely then will become more higher value, because the preference in buying is for an awnless product. If we don't have any awnless wheat, then they'll buy whatever's going, and the pricing will be accordingly. Frosting, it's been hitting bigger areas and more consistently, I mean those traditional frost areas, than growers want to see. We just need more options if we're going to get frosted. So what has Kenton learnt this year, which you'll speak about first, and one of the things is, if you're in a cold area, the last thing you can do is sow late to avoid frost. You've got to have bulk. So we've really got to have varieties which we can seed on time, seed early, get the bulk. And I suppose there's a couple of awnless wheats which we've got in development. The Mid-North High Rainfall site has been championing these as well, and we're doing some high quality work on them. So I suppose we're trying to get some genuine dual purpose. So there's probably two places they fit as a genuine dual purpose. So one is if you're getting smashed by frost regularly in a really vulnerable area. In my mind, you need quite a longer season variety. Next to the sign's Bennett. So not as long as that. That Bennett needs a genuine finish. We need to be able to get it in earlier to be able to use it. I think we want to be a little bit quicker than Bennett. But in saying that, Bennett is pretty amazing at finishing on a little bit of rain at the end of the year. So the two varieties we've got, 46 is one which is sitting about 5 to 7 days longer than Yitpi. So I think maturity-wise is really fitting in with those frosted areas, so we can get it planted early, it grows the bulk, it's holding its heading back to a reliable time. The other variety, 82, which is in the trials, which is also in development, is more of a Yitpi maturity. You know, I think probably a little bit later than Trojan most of the time going to head. And I see that more grain focused. You know, that one's always been more of a grain focused variety. This one's been more of a hay focused variety. So I suppose take an interest. We're trying to finish some different products, and they've been demanded. You know, probably my conversations with agronomists started about 5-6 years ago on all of this. If I go back, that we need some options in areas we're getting frosted, which might create some higher value dual purpose products. For us to make them successful, I think a couple of things are needed. First is APW minimums. I think we can make them fly at APW. That's a good enough grain quality. Grain quality isn't always easy, but ASW will be too low. So APW AH we want, and these, I'll know that next year, so I won't promise grain quality, but you know, they're certainly milling quality wheats, and you'd hope that, you know, we're in that zone where APW AHs we're going to get in that order. So I think that's essential. I think from a grain yield point of view, if they're genuinely targeting those vulnerable frost areas, then the grain yield, 85% of the yield of Scepters and Trojans, and they're going to still work in systems. If you're growing them more widely, then they're going to have to be a lot closer to the yield of the best varieties we've got, because we're using that hay option a lot less frequently. Both the early ones are developed from a Scout and Yitpi sort of backgrounds. So I think Rebecca phoned me in the year to tell me they were looking quite yellow at times. They're really good at picking up all those yellows from Yitpi and Scout in winter, but the other side we've seen is they hold their green leaf really well at this end of the year, particularly the one which is in the big strip up and down the hill. Once we get to spring, it's actually very tough at holding its green leaf, and it's quite good at that end of it. So if that sort of thing is opening a discussion with you, catch up with me and have a look at them in the big strips. This is something we're trying to add some diversity, and I suppose help an industry with a range of products which might work on farm. We're starting from pretty low base, Pete. Like, it's Orion is the one which is in the hay trial as the standard. You know, Orion's not bad, it's about right. It's a soft wheat. You know, it cascades out really fast into the chook sheds and the feed chains because it goes too high in protein. So I think if we can move it to APW, maybe an Orion type maturity and a bit longer, I think we can make them work. But they've got to have an element of toughness. If they're going to tip off at the heads real easily, and that, I don't think they've got a place for us. So we've got trials in the Mallee with these, and you know, you've really got to knock them into shape fast. Fortunately, you've had 17, 18 and 19 to test these varieties out, so we've given them a good nudge with the tight finish.
I guess when it comes to managing wheats, I think we've had a really good discussion about the main season wheat. So what I'm talking about is the wheats that should be sown in May, so the fast or the quick spring wheats, and we've really probably covered them off quite well, including the Emmys. I do think there's a lot more room to move in terms of yield in the Emmys, but I guess that's a breeding effort that will continue to happen. What I thought I'd talk a bit more about is some of those, I guess, outside of those main season wheats, where some of the other wheats might fit in. So for me, there's probably 4 or 5 different scenarios where you're looking at maybe thinking about different wheats. So mixed farming, the dual purpose use, so that'd be for grazing and grain. Making the most of early sowing opportunities would be another one. And even dry sowing, you're thinking about where some of these varieties might fit for dry sowing. And then we have even frost management, which we've touched on, and the dual purpose use for hay and fodder, which Colin's touched on with the dual purpose awnless wheats. So maybe starting with the winter wheat story, and we'll move back into May. But I guess for me, when we talk about early sowing, I know we're all talking about early sowing today, but maybe we should probably just define it a little bit more. And for me, early sowing is now, it's probably really early sowing, but I'm going to call it early sowing, before the 20th of April. And when we talk about early sowing, we're talking about actually germinating before the 20th of April. So a germination date before the 20th of April. And then what I'm going to call slightly earlier sowing is that period from the 25th, or the Anzac Day, into the 5th of May, where some of the Rockstars, Catapult, Trojan really have their fit. And then we have main season, which a lot of the faster mid wheats really have their fit into May. So if we want to be sowing before the 20th of April into moisture, that is different to dry sowing. So when we want to be sowing before the 20th of April, I guess most of the work we've been focused on is that you really need a slower developing wheat to do that. And the best way to do that has been a winter wheat. I'll come back to the new springs that we have. But certainly the story that's come out of the winter wheat work is that you have to actually choose a winter wheat that's adapted for your environment, because they are very stable in their flowering date. So no matter when you sow them from, let's say, the 15th of March, and if they emerge any time up until the 20th of April, their flowering date will be pretty much within a week. So that's what we talk about, their stability. But what that actually means is you actually have to select a different winter wheat for your different environment, for your flowering date. So it's kind of an issue for breeding companies as well, because it actually means they've got to develop a whole suite of winter wheats that are suited to a whole different number of environments. Whereas you look at the broadly adapted Scepters, Vixens of the world, they all fit quite well across South Australia when they're sown in May. So that is a little bit of a bottleneck when it comes to winter wheat breeding. But certainly at Hart, Illabo, what we're calling a midwinter. We also have a faster winter in Longsword, and then the slower winters for this environment would be something like the Bennett, but mostly Illabo has been the best performing, or the best adapted winter wheat to this Hart environment over the 3 years of trial work, provided it was established in April, provided it was established before the 20th of April. And then we still are seeing some yield decline from the winter wheats when they start emerging later than that into May. So that, if you start now thinking about dry sowing, that's where the risk really is. If you want to sow a winter wheat, you really have to have them established, I think, before the 1st of May with the current suite of winters that we have. In terms of utilising winters in the system for grazing, most of our recommendations are you really have to keep plant numbers up, so 150 plants per metre squared, and nitrogen up front in that situation, because you're interested in biomass, and we weren't really affecting yield or losing yield from a winter wheat under that scenario. If it's grain only, you really only need 50 plants per metre squared emerged in April. So provided you've got 50 plants per metre squared, and even defer your nitrogen up until growth stage 30, that's also fine. We're not seeing a difference or a yield penalty, because we've got a long time to till. They've got a long vegetative period. They're getting plenty of yield potential from that earlier sowing. Where else they may fit, I guess the traditional way to manage frost was to sow late and flower late. Where we can now start thinking about with some of these winter wheats is to sow early and flower late. And what that actually does is it gives us yield potential in some of these cold environments where we don't get much biomass through June, July. And really the only way to get yield potential is to start sowing earlier, but then we still want to flower late to avoid the frost. And that's really where, as you push over the hills into the colder environments, where Bennett has had its real fit, and even Illabo to some extent in the Mallee for that purpose. So that for me is where the winter wheats really have their fit, exploiting early sowing opportunities. And what we know is they're basically yielding similar to Scepter sown on time. And I guess what it's helping us do is avoid sowing a lot of our main season wheats too late. So we shouldn't be expecting more yield, but it's just helping us open up the cropping program if that opportunity comes, which looks like about 40% of years you get a chance to establish a winter wheat at Hart before the 20th of April. So not quite, or a bit more than 1 in 3 years. Yeah, we've been going just with Secura, and if you think about it, you're actually getting really good canopy closure if you get it established and emerged even before the 5th of May. So you're comparing that to sowing a main spring at the start of May, which has got 1 leaf. So you've actually got a really thick canopy that is competing well with weeds. And we actually haven't had a big issue with late germination ryegrass in that scenario. The only one is Bennett. Bennett is a bit slow and a bit erect early. And if it doesn't have a good April and it's a bit stressed, you can see ryegrass coming in. I don't think Bennett's as vigorous early for weed competition. But mostly, like longsword, believe it or not, it almost looks like barley when it's tillering early, so it does actually cover the canopy quite quick. So I think the benefit of the competition outweighs probably the concern that you have. So we've talked about winters. Think about the slow spring. So we've mentioned Denison and Nighthawk. And from most of our experience, I don't have a lot of experience with Denison, but I've seen a bit of it this year. Pretty much the 5th of April to the 20th of April, they do actually have a fit from that planting date. I guess the big question for me is still what happens when they emerge after that sowing date. So still, I'm not sure that certainly with Nighthawk, it gets progressively later in its flowering date. So I still think you have to treat it a bit like a winter, and you'd like to see it emerge before the 20th of April because it does continue to get later in flowering date. I'm not 100% sure about Denison, but ideally you'd want a wheat that as it emerged later, it also came back to the pack and became quicker in its flowering date, so that if you could dry sow it, there's less risk of emerging late and actually flowering late. But they certainly have a great fit. So Nighthawk has been consistently yielding similar or even a little bit higher than Illabo at Hart when it has emerged around that 15th of April. So that can be done with slow spring wheats. It doesn't always have to be winters, and I think that's also been a good finding from the project. So they do have a good fit. And then as we move into what I'm calling slightly earlier sowing, I think that's where a lot of the action is. So from Anzac Day into the 5th of May, you'll see, let's call them similar to Trojan maturity, Catapult, Rockstar and Trojan. I think that's where they have their real fit, and that's been well explained this morning. But I think if you're on the 20th of April, for example, and you're dry sowing and you're nervous about when the break's coming, that really is the advantage of that type of wheat, which you could actually, I guess you're assuming you might get establishment early in the 25th of April, but it's also really quite competitive with main season wheats if it did emerge later into May. And then as we come into May, obviously the Scepter, Vixen, Emu Rock, Ballista, all those wheats become really, that's their optimal time to be sowing, and really want to be avoiding sowing later than the 20th or the 15th of May if we can. So I think that for me is where they all fit. Probably 3 clear categories. I don't think there's 12 categories, but we'll see how we go. Yes, we did see that, particularly in winter wheats, because if you go back and look at the temperatures, were actually really cold through May and June this year, and what that meant is that vernalisation was
sunny also.
Getting saturated. Well, yeah, sunny probably less an impact on development, but the vernalisation wheats were certainly getting saturated a bit earlier than what we'd expect. And if you look in New South Wales, there were some winter wheats actually breaking quite early in their vernalisation. It's not, here I am saying they're stable, they are stable, but they were just a little bit earlier because of that cold. But then conversely, if you sow a spring wheat and you had a warm autumn, for example, they can also race, and they're actually a lot less stable in their flowering date when you get these warm. Quite often we get warm Mays and quite often we get cold Mays. So there is some things going on I don't think we really quite understand. There's also drought stress into May, June, which accelerated things. And the spring wheats do have some mild vernalisation requirements, so they could have knocked that out quite early as well. So there's a lot of things going on. And depending on where we are, like if you probably drew a line at the 20th of April, that's really the cliff face. If you start sowing before then, you can see this 30-day difference in the spring wheats. After that, like you're probably talking the 7 to 10 days, and it's also the day length. So sometimes you get a spring wheat that, like 2 weeks in April is a lot.